So I thought we would start with what the Bellevue Avenue area looked like more than 100 years ago. So this would have been even before this library was built, when people were asking for the library. Upper Montclair at that time had a population of about 7,000. And if you wanted to go to the library, which was downtown, you had to get there by horse or carriage or shoe leather. So it was kind of a production. It wasn't like a 10-minute jaunt in the car. This is the intersection of Valley and Bellevue. You're on Bellevue looking toward, this is where the bank is, the Chase Bank is now. So you get a sense of, it almost looked like the Wild West in some sense. This is Bellevue Avenue looking from Valley Road, looking toward the library, toward the future library site. This was a period from about the 1880s to the 1930s where Upper Montclair just had an explosion of growth. And it really went from this kind of town that had dirt streets, horses and carriages, to the suburban enclave that we know now. So this was a transformative period. It was a period where cultural institutions like the Art Museum and civic institutions like the library really came to flourish. And there were also these buildings that started coming out. Some of these buildings are after the library opened, but they were all within this span of growth when the neighborhood or the area became much more attractive in terms of real estate. Things like these were amenities that would make people want to buy property here, move here. So it was all part of a boom. It was also, it was a real civic shot in the arm because there were, you could literally count on one hand the number of architect designed masonry buildings in Upper Montclair before the library came to be. This was one of them. This is Union Congregational Church. And this is St. James Church as it looked back then. The fire station, and the post office on the right, and this is what the Learning Express used to look like. The post office didn't exist before the library, but this was a dry goods store and Anderson Apartments upstairs. So these were the only buildings really in Upper Montclair of any substance in terms of architectural design and permanence. Now, the residents of Upper Montclair, those 7,000 people, were a little annoyed because downtown Montclair had just opened its own Carnegie Library in 1904. As early as 1898, there had already been talk about creating a branch at Upper Montclair, but it hadn't happened. And again, if you're going to have to get on your horse to go to the library, it's a little bit of a hassle. And people were complaining about that. And so about 36 people signed this petition. And God bless the library's local history collection. This petition is still there. So you can see that they were complaining about how inconvenient it was to go to the library, and they were asking for one to be built. So this was kind of the germ for that movement to happen. This was the first Carnegie Library in town, which is still exists. It's at the intersection of Church Street and Valley Road. It's now one half of the Unitarian Universalist Church. Now, the very first Upper Montclair branch library was in a real estate office in Bellevue Avenue, just near the railroad tracks. And it was in the real estate office of this fellow right here. His name is John Mancini. And he just sold real estate and insurance, but he was willing to let the library keep 200 books in his real estate office, and it was run by 2 volunteer teenage girls. As I mentioned, there were 200 books in the library then. By the library, I mean the Upper Montclair branch. There are now 22,000 books in the Upper Montclair branch, so quite a transformation. The history is rather unclear on exactly where this very first office of Mr. Mancini was. Some people say that it was in what is called the trunk building. This is the trunk building. This stands where the Bellevue movie theater now stands. So maybe it was there, or maybe it was on the other side of the street. Here's the trunk building where the Bellevue movie theater is now. I think it was probably in one of these buildings here, which is roughly where the Bellevue Plaza parking lot is now. And specifically, I think it was in this building, and we don't know for sure, but this says real estate and insurance, and when you look on census records, Mancini is down as a real estate and insurance guy. So I wouldn't bet my life on it, but I might bet $100 on it. This was one of the most popular books at the time for people to check out. Just thought I'd throw that in because we are talking about books here too. The second location was also on that same strip of Bellevue Avenue on the north side in one of those buildings you saw that probably no longer exists, but was roughly across from where the John Love Coffee is now. Now the third location was right around here. None of these buildings, neither Murph's, Gap, or Saunders existed between 1906 and 1911 when the third location was in this spot. But it would have been probably roughly where the Gap is now. And this is the interior of one of those original libraries. We don't know which of the three locations it was, but my guess is also it's the one where the Gap is now. So you get a sense of how primitive things were back then. Now let's talk about Andrew Carnegie, because he made this all happen. You probably know that he was a Scottish immigrant. He was born in this weaver's cottage in Scotland, and his family was destitute and came to Pennsylvania in 1848. And of course, he became a fabulously wealthy industrialist, steel baron. Love him or hate him, he was a big philanthropist. He wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth, which advocated giving away money for philanthropy, and that book spurred philanthropy all across the United States, not just by him, but by other wealthy people. So he was very, very influential in philanthropy, and probably best known by most people for Carnegie Hall and for his libraries. He was also hated by a lot of people. He was involved, his company was involved in what was called the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania at one of his steel mills. And it was a strike that went on for something like 142 days. People died, people were injured, it was very nasty. And he was basically, the labor basically lost that fight, but he was forever reviled by many people. This is a cartoon basically making fun of his library building. People felt that his library program, although it existed before the strike, it really did pick up a lot after the strike, and a lot of people felt that he was trying to burnish his image, kind of do some PR damage control. And so he was not the most favored of figures after that. Some towns would refuse to take Carnegie Library money. For example, Paterson, New Jersey, just up the street, which is a hotbed of labor at the time. Its original library burned down in 1902, and Carnegie offered to build them a new library, and they said, no, we don't want your money. So not everybody was thrilled to have a Carnegie Library. I want to point out, if you've noticed when you see the library, this is above the doorway, the fact that it's a free public library. You'll see that on a lot of libraries around the country. And that's because this stems from something called the free library movement. Around the second half of the 19th century, reformers started to view libraries as sort of instruments of social change. So we had this rapidly industrializing nation, a lot of poor workers, a lot of immigrant labor, a lot of downtrodden people, and so progressive reformers saw libraries as one way to lift people up, both morally, culturally, personal improvement, And also, libraries were seen as a wholesome alternative to saloons and gambling parlors. So the free library movement sort of picked up a lot of steam, and in New Jersey, by 1890, the state passed legislation that allowed towns like Montclair to levy taxes to fund libraries. And so in 1893, Montclair did that. Before that, there were libraries, definitely, but generally they were subscription libraries, where the way you would pay money for a pool club or a tennis club or something like that, you would pay money to be able to use a library. And the Crane family, which was one of the big settlers of Montclair, they, in 1869, did start a subscription library. You paid $3 a year, which is roughly about $70, I think, in today's money. But even with that, that would be a barrier to a lot of people who wouldn't be able to afford the library. So the free public library movement was a very strong thing. It created a lot of libraries around the country, and the library was very proud to proclaim that. This is one of the original libraries in Montclair. It's not the first one. This building still exists. It's the Mun Tavern. But it's one of the earlier ones. It predates the first Carnegie Library, and it stemmed from the free library movement. And this is a rendering of the Montclair Library that we all know now on Upper Montclair. And again, they use the term free. It's something that they were very proud of. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how Montclair managed to get two Carnegie Libraries, because although that's certainly not unheard of, it is unusual. It's not unusual for a big city like Detroit, where I think Carnegie gave Detroit something like 8 branch libraries, but for a town the size of Montclair, where your Carnegie Library grant is based on your population, it's very unusual. So this was the first library, first Carnegie Library, which I think I said earlier, it opened in 1904. So that means a decade later, we got the second one. This is the interior of the first Carnegie Library, which now used by the Unitarian Church. So several years before the Bellevue branch got going, there was already a pretty strong move afoot to build a second, an Upper Montclair branch library. And this again is the first Carnegie Library. So a piece of property was bought for the Upper Montclair branch library even before the Carnegie grant was given, even before the Carnegie grant was applied for. So on Christmas Eve of 1907, the library trustees purchased the site that we have now from this guy. His name is William Power. He was a major landowner in Upper Montclair. If you go back and look at the old maps, he's on all over the place. He just owned big tracts of property all over the place. So he sold the land, and there were several advantages to this site, reasons why it was desirable. One of them was it was on a major thoroughfare, Bellevue Avenue being a major thoroughfare, but it was also a corner lot, which is something that the Carnegie Corporation likes. Corner lots are good because you can have a building that has windows on all 4 sides, letting in a lot of light, which obviously is good for reading. And it's in a transition zone between commercial and residential, which is a good thing. Part of the Carnegie movement to build branch libraries was to bring books close to people's homes. So you're in a transition zone, that's a good thing. And it was also on a lot that was large enough to allow for expansion, which was also something else that the Carnegie Corporation liked. So they had purchased this lot, which really sort of had all the bells and whistles, checked all the boxes for a future Carnegie Library. But the secret weapon, really, in my opinion, was this guy. His name is the Reverend Henry Jackson. He was the Reverend of the Union Congregational Church, and he was new to Montclair. I think he came to Montclair in 1907, and he had just come from Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, where he had been very instrumental in negotiating a Carnegie Library in Swarthmore, not for the college, well, for the college, even though he wasn't officially connected to the college, but somehow he was heavily involved in getting the Swarthmore Library. So he knew the ropes, he knew what to do, and when he came to Montclair, even though he was not on the library board, he was an Upper Montclair person, he offered to help out. And he somehow managed to get a personal meeting with Andrew Carnegie in his house. So can you imagine, this is Andrew Carnegie's house now at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, but can you imagine, you know, going and ringing the doorbell and talking money with Andrew Carnegie? That's what this guy did. He actually was not that well liked in Upper Montclair. He wound up sort of leaving in like the year after the library opened. He was considered aggressive and modern. The terms that they used. But I assume he was just, you know, some go-getter kind of guy and rubbed some people the wrong way. But he was very successful. He and one of the people who had been instrumental in starting that 1904 petition went and met with Carnegie one-on-one and said, we want a library and here's why. And then he filled out, the Reverend Jackson filled out the official application. I think that's a little odd because it wasn't the library trustee who filled it out, but this Reverend Jackson guy filled out the application and got the ball rolling. So this is a letter from the Carnegie Corporation. In April 9th, 1913, the Carnegie Corporation offered to give $20,000 for an Upper Montclair library. And the library trustees wrote back and said, well, can we have $30,000? And he said no. Basically, he said, don't be greedy. He said the amount of $20,000 was not decided upon haphazard. The amount, which has already been promised to Montclair, $60,000 in all, he's counting the original library, is 50% more than is ordinarily given to a community of its population. So he was basically saying, we're being really nice to you already, don't push your luck. So they were, they wrote back a letter the next day saying, okay. And so this is what we have now, of course. A little bit about the architecture. It's neoclassical revival, and it's really a little jewel box, and it's very much the kind of building that the Carnegie Corporation advocated. The Carnegie people got really annoyed with these towns that wanted to build big, fancy, overblown libraries with domes and Greek temple fronts and columns. Anything that was ostentatious and ate up money, they did not like. They were all about being efficient, being practical, and they wanted the architecture to be plain, dignified, but not elaborate and ostentatious. And so this really kind of fits that bill. Just a couple of pictures I'm going to run through very quickly, and thanks to John Skillen. He took some wonderful photos. So you just got it, you see it's got the big windows to let in the light. It's got a copper roof. It's got the rusticated corners. It's got pilasters, which are attached to the building rather than independently freestanding columns, which are more expensive. It glows beautifully. And it has these side lights around the doors and the transoms. They decorated entablature there. And I'm sure you are probably familiar with this quote above the doorway. This inscription is from Isaac Barrow, who's a 17th century philosopher and mathematician. If you probably can't read it from where you're sitting. What it says is, he that loveth a book will never want a faithful friend, a wholesome counselor, a cheerful companion, an effectual comforter. And now, this quote also, this is Isaac Barrow, by the way, and this quote also appears in the Chicago Library that was built in 1897. That particular library has quotes all around it, and this is one of them. And it wouldn't surprise me if the architect for this building was aware of this. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. There are some nice little features that aren't here anymore. This wrought iron grill door is gone. But this shows you this is the architect, some of the architect's drawings, and it shows quite the elaborate detail, the classical motifs that are here throughout the building. You really kind of have to look closely. We take the building for granted. We're so used to looking at it, we don't spot some of these the urns and the acanthus leaves and things like that. But there's a whole lot of detail packed into this building if you just look for it. And the open book motif, you may have noticed, it's there up there in the frieze, and that's a close-up of it. This is the architect. His name is Francis Nelson, Francis A. Nelson. The library was really his first civic building for Upper Montclair, or for Montclair at all. Before he did this building, he was a New York City architect, but he lived in Montclair. He was in a partnership, so technically the architects are Nelson and Van Wegenen, but Nelson was definitely the lead architect in this. He had done some very amazing, impressive, monumental churches in New York City, and he also did a lot of estates for wealthy people, like mansions, basically. That was kind of his stock in trade. But after he did the library, he did a lot of other buildings that you're going to be familiar with. He did this, this was a post office when it opened, this building here, and the building, it's all one building, it looks like two, but he designed that after he designed the library. Also after the design, he did the Masonic Temple, which is now Williams-Sonoma. He did the Women's Club of Upper Montclair. This is the inside of the Women's Club. And he did this tiny little cottage on Northview, just around the corner from the library. It was Miss Tracy's music studio, and I'm amazed that he did this, because really most of his other houses were mansions, and mansions in Long Island, mansions in Pennsylvania, mansions in Montclair. He designed a house there's a big brick house where Bellevue Avenue dead ends into Upper Montclair, into Upper Mountain Avenue. If you're familiar with that, he designed that. Lots of big palatial houses, and this little cute thing. He also designed the memorial tower for St. James. This was to honor the war dead from World War I. So this tower was 1919. So this is the floor plan for the library. The Carnegie Corporation did not dictate the architecture of the buildings that you were going to build, but it had some strong suggestions. And it gave everybody a book called Notes on the Erection of Library Buildings. And it gave sample floor plans. This adheres fairly closely. It's not, a Xerox copy, but it is in the spirit of some of the floor plans that are given out. And it gives a whole bunch of suggestions on what your library should be like, exterior and interior. And design review was part of the process. You had to submit your design, and it had to pass muster. One of the interesting things about this floor plan, you can't see it in this small size, but there was a room called the Fumigation Room. And that was where they put books where you could heat the books up to 170 degrees for 24 hours. It was supposed to kill anything that could transmit tuberculosis, which was a big problem back then. I don't know if that would really work. I don't know enough about that, but that was a concern, and that was something that was built in and shows up on the floor plan. In terms of the style and design that the Carnegie Corporation wanted, basically they said they wanted, quote, good taste in building, and they wanted efficient buildings, but they did say that architects should express their individual style. So, it wasn't as if you worked for a McDonald's franchise and you just had to have these copycat buildings. However, I wanted to show you the vaulted ceiling in here. However, when you look at Carnegie buildings all around the country, you can often spot them right away, because there is a family resemblance. This is, I'm just going to go through some, doesn't that look a little like ours? They have a certain look about them, although some go off on a riff. This is pretty different. That's really different. That's different. That's a California one, so that's more the local tradition. But the point is, you can often tell which is a Carnegie library, because they did sort of follow these guidelines, even though they might have tweaked them a little bit. And also, most of the town's building libraries had a specific idea in mind about what a library should look like. They wanted a certain amount of dignity. They wanted something very traditional. Nobody pretty much was doing anything sort of avant-garde or experimental. Tradition was definitely the way to go, and that was what the communities wanted. It wasn't being forced on them by the Carnegie Company. And so you can really see strong similarities. Now, some of the features that you'll see in most Carnegie libraries, and this is a picture of the Upper Montclair Library, one is a centralized circulation desk. And most of these buildings, including ours, were built with either low or no partitions, and the circulation desk in the middle, so that you only had to hire one librarian, and that librarian could survey the realm, and that was the design. Also, I just want to make a point and tell you a little tangent about this photograph. It was taken by Louis W. Hine, if any of you are familiar with him. He was a documentary photographer who took pictures of child labor, and his photos, which I know you've seen, because they are just out there in the conscious of America, these photos basically helped get legislation passed ending child labor. So he was commissioned, and I cannot find out the story about how this happened, but in the early 1930s, he was hired to take pictures of both the libraries. And so we have a nice little trove of Hine photos of the Upper Montclair Library, and this is one of them. So I mentioned to you, low partitions, so that you could have a free visual view. This is an example of that. Also, you see the large windows. The Montclair Library is a little deviant from the design guidelines, because the design guidelines wanted windows that did not even start until 6 feet off the ground, so that you could have the first 6 feet devoted to bookshelves. So we didn't follow that to the letter there, but that was the idea that Carnegie Corporation was advocating. And here again, I just want to give you a sense of the expanse of the space, but also, when we saw the exterior of the building, we saw how elaborately detailed it was in little nuances. The same attention was paid on the inside, particularly the little vestibule, the portico where you enter, with the wooden design and the pediment on top, and there's a little clock there on the right-hand side of the picture. And you've all walked through it, but you probably haven't noticed. But it's this very elaborate little entranceway out of carved oak. And it's another interior picture. And then, this one, right? I'm showing this to you not just because Ed's in the picture, but because one of the things about the design of these Carnegie libraries that was different from a lot of earlier libraries is that you could help yourself to books. In a lot of the older libraries, there was a librarian who was like the guardian, and you had to go up to a table and give a little slip and request a book, and they had to go back and get it and bring it to you. The modern library that you saw with the Carnegie designs lets you basically be empowered to browse and get your own books off the shelf. And this was supposed to reflect a level of trust between the institution and, in many cases, the working class. So that was a very important part of the design. And I also just want to point out, I'm sure you all know, there's this beautiful oak woodwork throughout the library. In the early plans, when they're negotiating how much this is all going to cost, they actually do upgrade to quarter sawn oak. So, which gives it, the quarter sawn is a certain way that you saw it at the lumber yard, and it gives it a different kind of grain exposure that really gives the wood an extra depth and richness. So you'll see this, it's really a lovely feature, especially when there's light glowing on it. I just like this cartoon. It says, "Have you anything confidential on Upper Montclair?" Now this is the contract for the general contractor who built the library. You probably can't see it. He's got this beautiful signature. His name is John Pickin. This is John Pickin. And So he was the general contractor. He was the one who built the whole building, obviously not just by himself, but he was the guy. And he also seemed to be heavily involved in the woodwork, the shelves and everything. He would also become a town council member, ultimately, in 1933, and the township building inspector in the 1940s. So he was quite the guy. Now, we've seen a lot of guys, so we're going to turn to the ladies for a little while. This is Bessie English, perfect last name for the first paid librarian. So she was the first paid librarian for Upper Montclair, and that was, let me go back to her. She got her job in 1906, and as I said before she took the job, it was basically volunteer teenage girls. So women were actually very influential in establishing the first library in Montclair, not the Bellevue branch, but the very first library its genesis was something called the Wednesday Afternoon Club, which was a women's club. And they were the ones who pushed for the free library to be voted on in Montclair, and they completely got the ball rolling to establish libraries in Montclair. So they get a lot of credit for that. Men, however, would seem to be more the driving force for the Bellevue branch. Every trustee, every piece of letter written was the same cadre of guys. The library profession in the 19th century was actually largely male, and then around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it opened up more to females. I'm not sure exactly why that happened. But this is a librarian photographed by Lewis Hine again. This is the main library. And this is another photograph of librarians in the main library, Maine being the 1904 Carnegie Library, processing some new books. The Carnegie's philanthropy actually really sort of broadened the field for female librarians by virtue of creating so many libraries around the country. There was more than 16,000 libraries around the country were Carnegie libraries, and so this opened up a lot of possible librarian positions, and women filled many of them. Again, this is back to the Upper Montclair Library, another Hine photo. And this is the central library desk, the centrally located desk again, which people say that the central position of this really gave women more a position of power. They were the overseers, essentially the overseers on the factory floor in a sense. And here it is in the 21st century. Now the children's room is actually a very important feature of Carnegie libraries, because in the earlier days of libraries, usually children under 12 were banned from most libraries. And then this started to change, and in fact, almost every single Carnegie library has a special reading room just for children. In the Bellevue Library, it's the lower floor, which you see in this picture. This is, I guess, the 50s or the 60s, the same room. Around the time that the Carnegie libraries were being built, and around the time more and more women were becoming librarians, there was a growing body of scientific information out there about child psychology and about child development that sort of delineated particular stages of development for children. So childhood became a more scientific sort of thing, and librarians who dealt with children had a little more status because of that. It wasn't just like taking care of the kids. You were doing something significant and scientific and that sort of thing. Then I also just want to talk quickly about the role that the library has in the community, and particularly the Upper Montclair branch library. One of them, of course, is literary, being author visits. This is an author visit, I think, in the 50s at the Upper Montclair branch. And town hall meetings, as Bill Herlock knows. Another literary thing is book clubs. This was something called the Circulation Club, or no, Circulation Circle, which I'm not totally sure what it is, but it seems as if they did meet at the library, on the lawn of the library at some point. This looks like maybe the 1930s. This is another Hine photo. It's also a place where kids hang out after school, particularly Mount Hebron. You know, a place to go and do homework after school if the library's open. And particularly in the 50s, and maybe even the 40s, it seems, Boy Scouts were in heavy use of that library, earning some kind of reading badge I've read about. So this is a picture of 2 Boy Scouts with a big stack of books. And the plaza is not original to the library. I'm not sure when the plaza was installed, but the plaza has also become a public space, and that's important. And this is another Upper Montclair's, which has nothing to do with the library, really, but it says, well, I'm sure Kinsey never spoke to anyone in Upper Montclair. So I want to talk a little bit about preservation. I think I said earlier there was something like 1,600 Carnegie libraries, and that's just the United States. He also had libraries built in other English-speaking countries, but just for the purposes of the United States, 1,600 libraries, about 200 of them have been demolished over the years. In New Jersey, he built 36 libraries between 1900 and 1917. All but 7 of them still stand, and about half of them still serve their original purpose. So this is in Riverside, California, and this is it in 1964. So this has happened to a number of Carnegie libraries. However, some of them have had better fates. This is the one in Montclair that is now half of the Unitarian Church. That's adaptive reuse. So the architecture is very much intact, and it's being used. It's in good shape. You know, it's having a happy life. And this is one in Thief Falls, Minnesota, which is also adaptive reuse. This is becoming cultural offices, a cultural affairs office for the municipality there. And this, believe it or not, is in Ontario. The Carnegie Library is inside that. Wow. So that's not the most unusual adaptive reuse I've seen. But the Montclair Library, the Upper Montclair Library, is particularly special, not just because it's on the National Register, which it is, but because it has it looks almost identical to the way it originally did, with some modest changes, and it's still in its original use. So that's a very, very special thing. It's very fortunate. It's one of 12 Carnegie libraries in New Jersey to be on the National Register of Historic Places. It was placed on the National Register in 1986. And so over a century, only a few things have really been lost in this building. One of them is the wrought iron grill door, which no one knows what happened to it. Well, we know what happened to it. It was removed in 1957. I think there were some maintenance issues with it, and there was some complaint that it was a little heavy, like hard for kids to open. But we don't know where it is. We don't know whatever. It went to the scrapyard or what. We have no idea. So there it is when it was in place. And then, about as bizarre as you can imagine, in 1993, I believe, there were 2 lamps like you see now that were stolen in the dead of night. They were connected electrically, they were functioning lights, they were bolted to the granite steps, and in the middle of the night, someone came and hacked them off and took them away. So they were replaced. I'm sorry, this is what they looked like originally. You can sort of see them in that photo. You know, the replacements look pretty convincing to me. But I mean, the chutzpah of that just blows my mind. Then the light fixtures in the ceiling have changed over the years. This, I believe, is probably the original light fixture. And then in the 50s, you got this. And now you have these. So really, those are the main changes. I mean, well, one other change is this, there's an art show in what is now the parking lot. It was a grassy area in the back of the library originally, so that's now a parking lot. And the hedges that are around the perimeter are gone. And you know, the plaza is there now. But otherwise, it's very, very similar and intact. Now, over the years, there have been three instances where closing of the library, the branch library, was proposed. And as you know, with the Bellevue, I think it was closed for about 6 months. And this is the ceremony when it reopened, and I know everyone was thrilled about that. This is, again, another Hein photo of some boys looking at a map. You know, the Bellevue Library has always been something really to go to the map for, I think. You know, whether you're petitioning to get it built in the first place, or whether you're working to keep it open and keep it vibrant. For over a century, it's remained, you know, quite beloved, a quite beloved community institution. And you know, whether it's a portal to books in print or digital bits and bytes, you know, the library remains an anchor in the community and an entree to the whole wide world.